Dive in and get started. Before we begin, I wanted to note two things. One, as we're sharing, for those if you're not aware of it, I think in most browsers you can double click on one of the things within the video and it will enlarge it. I would encourage you to double click on the slides being presented and not on our faces, but it's up to you. But it'll be especially helpful in the second more exciting half of this talk when I turn it over to Jen and she's actually sharing some of the design work. I think you'll want to double click so you get a good size view of it as you can. The other thing to note, at least that I'm aware of, two other things actually. One is there's a SurveyMonkey link that's provided early on in the chat, and I think we'll duplicate it again at the end of this session into the chat. And DrupalCon really appreciates getting feedback on the sessions, as do we, because they share some of it with us, I think, at least they have in the past. So please, if you have time, give us some thoughts. And lastly, I think we're going to try to seed questions as it goes along. We'll see how that works. One way to make it a little easier is if you're providing a question in the middle of the talk as it comes to your mind into the chat, if you could just precede your question with the letter Q : and then the question. So it'll make it a little easier for us to scan through and see if there are questions that people have added. So Jen, was there anything else that I was supposed to cover before we actually dive in?
No, I think that's it.
Okay. Well, let me make sure everything is working here for my slides, and we'll dive in. So thanks for coming, everyone. If you're not sure what this session is, this is Designing for Chaos, which is essentially the story behind the design process for Olivero, which is the new theme being developed for Drupal, the new default theme. So there was another session this morning. Two other of our colleagues, Putra Bonacorsi and Mike Herschel, gave a session that was more focused on the development process, and so I would encourage you, if you missed that, to try to find that out. But I think these will be available after. Fingers crossed. So, but yeah. Let's get started. Like I said, I'm Jared, or if you were here earlier during intros, my name is Jared Ponchot. This is Jen Witkowski as well. Say hi to Jen. We've worked together at Lullabot now for several years. We're both designers at Lullabot, and we both have spent years doing design projects at Lullabot. We do UX and UI design work for large-scale Drupal projects, and often sort of larger design systems kinds of projects. But Lullabot is a company that's been around in the Drupal space for a long, long time now, since the very early days of Drupal. And if you're not familiar with us, come check us out or say hello at our booth during some of the booth times. There's a number of Lullabots that hang out there. But yeah, Lullabot does strategy, design, development stuff. And so we work kind of in a client services mode. I joined Lullabot in about, I think it was 2010, which is a decade ago now, which is kind of hard to believe. And I remember at the time that I joined Lullabot, I also came across Jen Simmons. I met her through a thing early on. Lullabot had this sort of trainers at large thing at the time. Lullabot was doing a lot of Drupal training, and we both had applied into that. Jen Simmons was helping Drupal at the time with a project called Bartik. If you're not familiar with Bartik, it has been a part of Drupal for a long time now. When I joined Lullabot in April of 2010, she was maybe 2 months into this process of creating Bartik, which was the sort of default theme for Drupal now for a decade. Jumping ahead a little bit, before I talk about what Mike and Putra began now, I forgot to mention, like, there's a number of people who worked on Bartik over the years, and it was around for a decade, served a lot of people very well. I'd be curious if in the chat, if you're somebody that actually worked on Bartik at some point, maybe raise your hand somehow through chat or something. I'd love to see how many people that are at the session that actually had a hand in Bartik. But for all of you who did, thank you. It's quite a feat to make something that'll last for 10 years. So how did we get to where we are now? There are other people who led the groundwork for what Jen and I are going to talk about. Our colleagues Putra Bonacorsi and Mike Herschel had the sort of germ of the idea for this, and it happened at DrupalCon Seattle last year. I think, if I'm getting the story right, they were hanging out in the lobby and ended up talking with Angie Byron and Lowry Escala. I may be saying that Lowry's name wrong. If so, I apologize if I'm mispronouncing. But they had a conversation in the hotel lobby at DrupalCon Seattle about sort of what constitutes a great CMS theme. And that conversation led Putra and Mike to wonder at the fact that there was no current project for creating a new Drupal core theme with Drupal 9. And so they started stewing on that. Also at DrupalCon Seattle, Dries mentioned in his keynote there that while experts still love Drupal, beginners or CMS newcomers still have some negative connotations. And a key driver of that negative sentiment is that out-of-the-box experience, the fact that it includes a theme design that's now a decade old. So Putra and Mike started creating a few initial goals that they had, things that made them interested in working on it, things like an updated modern design. They wanted a theme that felt more current, potentially for the next 5 years is kind of the way it's been talked about, how we're thinking. We're hoping it doesn't have to last as long as Bartik did. But functionality that supports new features. So they wanted the theme to support commonly used Drupal functionality like second level navigation and embedded media, layout builder, and so on. And then lastly, WCAG, however you're supposed to say, the WCAG AA conformance. They wanted the theme to be compliant and to ensure that it passes Drupal's stringent accessibility standards with flying colors. So Putra and Mike actually gave a talk right before us, as I mentioned today. If you didn't catch that, hopefully you'll be able to find it after. Also, Putra wrote an article about the genesis of this whole thing as well. It's on lullabot.com. If you want to find that, just go to bit.ly/Olivero D9, and you can find her article. Okay, so once Putra and Mike decided to try to take on this project, it was at this point that they began looking to assemble a team to work on it. And they reached out to Jen, who mentioned it to me. And then we got to pretend like we knew what we were doing as we began the process of designing a new Drupal theme. So in this talk, what we're going to try to answer is just a handful of things. Who are we? Why did we do this? How did we do this? And what specifically would you say we did here? So you're already right here. That's the good news. We're going to get into the meat pretty quickly here. And hopefully we'll have some time for questions at the end, because we'll move kind of quickly through some high level stuff and leave open space for questions. So let's see. The challenges of designing a CMS theme. I want to start by framing some of these challenges that actually we weren't necessarily that familiar with, because like I said, a lot of the work we do is sort of very specific design work for clients. Designing a CMS theme was a unique thing. We had to figure out two sort of key questions, and these are key questions for any design project I've ever done, really, and that's who is our audience and who are our stakeholders. They're the fundamental things for any design process, and the work that Jen and I do typically provides pretty clear answers to these. These aren't the hard questions. When you're designing a theme that anyone can use for nearly any kind of site that they're making with an open source CMS, how you define things like your audience and designing and feedback and approval processes is actually really tricky. So how you solve for this can create whole new problems as well. That's kind of what we discovered as we started hashing out how we were going to do this. And there are two potentially alluring approaches to these problems that are actually themselves problematic. And that's what we worked to avoid. So the first problematic approach to this is just include everything for everyone, thereby making something that's unwieldy and unusable for everyone. And you just can't include everything. The needs are too varied with something like a CMS. We wanted to have some kind of focus, intent, and opinion as we created, because we just knew we weren't going to be able to make something that does everything for everyone. The second problematic approach is to design for the average and thereby sort of wind up designing for no one specifically. This is sometimes referred to as the average man problem. If you're not familiar with this, back in World War II, we came to grips with the fact that the US military had spent decades designing and building airplane cockpits and controls for what it called the average man. There's a really long backstory to this that goes way back to the origins of astronomy and traces through the American Civil War. If you're into those kinds of things, there's a great episode of the podcast 99% Invisible called On Average that tells that story. But the gist of it is, by World War II, what our military began realizing was that they had been taking average measurements for Air Force pilots and sizing everything based on averages. So things like height, weight, arm length, etc. And what turned out to be true was that no one pilot actually matched any of these averages. So planes were crashing. It was really difficult. And this realization, people dying in crashes due to unwieldy cockpits, led to the design thinking behind modern cockpits, where you have things like adjustable seats, adjustable yokes, pedals, and whatnot. So we kind of took some inspiration for what came out of that in designing Olivero. We also had to work to figure out what features and controls needed to be adjustable, if you will. So what was our approach? Jen's going to get more into specifics in terms of the things that we actually did, but at a really high level, I want to try to frame our approach and philosophy. So first, we established some design principles, and this helped us define success in a way that was easy to remember and could kind of hold true even as we learned more about both our audience and our stakeholders throughout the process. So our principles were that, above all, we wanted to design something that was simple. We wanted to avoid unnecessary visual elements, colors, effects, complexity. We wanted to be modern. We wanted to take advantage of the capabilities and strengths of modern browsers and interaction patterns. Turns out browsers and front-end development have changed a bit over 10 years of Bartik. We wanted to make something that was focused, and this meant things like embracing high contrast, saturated color, negative space to draw the eye to what's most important. And we tried to sort of design defaults within the theme for the 80%. So what are the things that we can know are true of most and really bring focus to those? And lastly, flexible. We wanted to provide options and overrides to account for varied needs and preferences. So we then worked to zero in on what we could say about our audience and their sites, the people who would use this theme. And when you're designing a default theme for an open source CMS, like I said, there's an ocean of things that you just can't know about the people who will use it and the sites that they'll create. But there were a few things we felt were safe to say. These are largely people who are new to Drupal. The default theme ends up being used by people who are kicking the tires on Drupal. These people may not have programming or design skills, because often if you do, you're in the process of making a theme, not using the default theme. Because of this, these people also may have simpler content models, using just the core content types. They're not doing a lot of like heavy lifting on really complex models. So it needed to serve the base types really well. And despite things like the simplicity of the content model of core Drupal, we also knew that the content itself will vary widely. Things like lengths of titles and labels and things like that. There needed to be a lot of flexibility within the theme. So next we worked to try to figure out, who are our stakeholders? How do you do a project like this? We needed to answer questions like, who are our stakeholders? Who's going to provide the feedback, and when and how? And what do we want from them? What kind of feedback are we looking for? And what should approval look like? Who will approve which designs and how? I already mentioned the challenge we had of our real stakeholders being lots of people who may eventually use this theme and a broad Drupal community who cares a lot about it in many cases. But we needed some sort of approach to reining that in a bit. So our approach was to first establish a proxy group. We assembled a group of various core maintainers, as well as our team of designers and developers working on the project, that we could use initially to help begin the review and refinement process. And the goal here was to do as much due diligence as possible, to sort of weed out as many potential problems and issues with our design ideas as possible quickly, so that we could put something a bit more solid in front of the larger community for feedback. We tested and continued to iterate, and we did this a lot. We had a lot of help from our proxy group with things like accessibility testing along the way, so that we were able to do a lot of refinement, sort of weeding out these problems and not wasting the broader community's time on things that we could quickly solve. So other examples of things that changed a lot along the way through iteration, even changed since we finalized the designs and the real development process began. More design changes came in for things like, initially we had a style that used uppercase labeling, and it was for things like the RSS feed label or the share labels or things like that. But because these things would be flexible and could be overridden and also maybe localized to lots of different languages, we decided that we couldn't guarantee conciseness in them, and therefore uppercase was not a great idea. Things like the color palette evolved a bit as we continued to test and hone and refine for accessibility. Things like form states and all the varied states, refined and refined and refined some more to get them to where they were both accessible and felt visually clear and within the language of the design. We knew we wanted to eventually engage the broader community for feedback, so we did some work to define the kind of feedback we were looking for and what our timeline targets would be to help give people deadlines for providing feedback. Once we'd done a good bit of refinement in the design process and designed the kind of feedback we were looking for from the broader community, we published our process and those guidelines on Drupal.org, and we continued our refinement process based on the broader community's feedback. And one thing that felt like a success, at least to me, I think to Jen too, was that community feedback did not feel like an overwhelming onslaught. There wasn't just a slew of problems and bugs and complaints that was unbearable. The community provided some really great insights and helped catch a few things that had been missed, but it felt like the work we had done with the proxy group was really effective. Okay, so that's a super high-level flyover of sort of our approach, philosophy, the sort of underlying architecture of the process. And now we're going to jump into Jen, getting into some more details. She's going to talk about some things like, how did we identify the look and feel that we wanted to achieve? How did we collaborate to refine and establish that look and feel? And even better, what were those designs like along the way? What do things look like? So she is going to join us now, and I will take a back seat and enjoy the show.
Hey, everybody. So if you want to click on my slide deck to make it large, that would be fantastic. I'm going to, just a heads up, I'm going to switch between Keynote here and Figma. So there'll be like a quick second where you'll see nothing before I switch over to Figma, because I'm going to use Figma to walk through all of our designs. I'm going to talk about the design process for Olivero. Basically, I'd love to walk you through how we approach the visual exploration and how we finalize the design system. But before we begin, before I begin talking a little bit about the design process, I want to talk a little bit about how we answered the question, what are we designing? We basically had to figure out what the theme had to do before we actually started visual exploration. So it was important for us to understand the scope and restrictions of the project and what we could change versus what was nice to have versus things we really couldn't change at all. And we worked really closely with Mike and Putra to achieve this, who were our main developers. So what we did is we started off with Bartik as a base, and we created a list that captured all the components in Bartik, and then reviewed them with Mike and Putra to fully understand what we could change versus things that we really couldn't touch. And we also captured all the different ways that the components could appear. So this is what this process kind of looked like. So basically we went through Bartik, we captured screenshots, we added details, Mike and Putra added comments, and we went back and forth. As you can see, it was nothing fancy. We basically used a paper doc, but this whole process helped us better understand what we were designing for. And once we felt like we had this in a good spot and we both understood what we needed to design, we created really quick wireframes to review with developers to ensure that we had captured all the really important bits. So once we felt like we were in a really good place with the component documentation, we were able to start the visual phase. One thing to note is that we were working with stakeholders that were across multiple time zones and who already had pretty full days. We also had a really aggressive timeline. So we had to shorten the visual research phase by prioritizing what the big questions were and limiting the amount of design reviews we had with stakeholders. So the big question that we had that we needed stakeholders to answer was, what should the new theme look like? So what we did is we worked closely with our stakeholders that Jared reviewed to help answer this question. We didn't have a lot of time to spend on answering this question. So what we did is we created a single exercise called the spectrum analysis exercise, where stakeholders could go in and complete it on their own time by a specific due date that we had set. So you may be asking yourself, well, what is a spectrum analysis exercise? So it's an exercise that our team uses to help figure out what the client is thinking when it comes to the voice and tone of a theme or design. So what you do is you create a scale, and on one end is an adjective that could describe the look and feel of a site, or in this case, the theme. And then on the other end is another adjective that usually conflicts with the first. So as you see here, you have formal and casual. Stakeholders then go in and put a point on the scale and how they think the design should look and feel. Once that point is created, we then open it up for discussion and ask a bunch of questions so we can fully understand the thoughts and intentions behind why they put that point specifically at that place on the scale. And since we couldn't do this in person, what we did is we used InVision to complete this exercise. And we felt it worked really great because you could use InVision's comment functionality to create the point on the scale. Stakeholders could leave comments explaining their reasoning behind why they put that point on that specific place. And then we could ask questions, and even other stakeholders could chime in. So based on the spectrum analysis, we had identified the following keywords to help establish our voice and tone. So we have formal, light and bright, contemporary, professional, approachable, novel, cool, familiar, and high contrast. So we took those adjectives and combined them with our design principles in order to complete our design documentation. So as I mentioned, our design research phase was pretty short because we didn't have a lot of time. But we felt like we had enough information to move forward and start exploring visual approaches. One thing to note too is that our team tries to keep the design principles and adjectives in front of mind. So we'll use things like note cards, Post-its, whiteboards, vision boards to help remind us of the design principles and the voice and tone while exploring different visual approaches. So my personal favorite is the Post-its. So when I'm working on a visual approach, I'll have all different types of Post-its around my screen to kind of help remind me of the adjectives that I'm supposed to be designing for. So now came to the visual exploration phase. And our team uses something called the ZoomMox to explore different visual approaches to visual design. And ZoomMox are an alternative to style tiles, basically. So specifically what they are is basically you choose a wireframe, and then you kind of zoom in and choose a small section of that wireframe. And then you start exploring style in that specific section. We created 2 to 4 ZoomMox, each representing a completely different style or variations in a specific style. And to learn more about ZoomMox, there's an article that I wrote that gets a bit more specific about what they are and how to use them. So these are some of the ZoomMox that we had created. So we explored approaches that were a bit more traditional, like the one you see on the left, and ones that were a bit more modern, like you see on the right. When we felt like these were in a good spot, we shared them with our stakeholders, and they helped choose an approach for us to move forward with some, small minor revisions. One thing to note too is our team wasn't looking for an official sign off of, yes, this is the finalized style. We would have been in a much larger feedback loop that the timeline really didn't account for. What we were looking from our stakeholders was more of this is good, this is going in the right direction, let's keep moving forward, with the understanding that the design will evolve and change as we extend the design system to other pages and components. So once we had our ZoomMox complete, it was time to start thinking about the design system itself. And before I get into that, though, I just wanted to mention some of the tools that we had used to design Olivero. So the main UX UI tool that we had used was Figma. And Figma allowed us to collaborate and share progress much more quickly between Jared and I, share progress with our developers, and also share progress with our stakeholders. We used Zoom for conference calls where we could share work. We used Slack for really quick chatting back and forth. We used Dropbox Paper for informal notes. And then we used Google Docs for more formal documentation, like our design system documentation. I also just want to reinstate some of the challenges that we had to keep in mind while we were designing Olivero. As Jared had mentioned, accessibility was one of our main priorities. The theme had to be WCAG AA accessible. And in order to do this, we had to make sure that we're doing things like using proper color contrast, making sure that our typography was large enough to read, and ensuring that focus states and hover states were used correctly throughout the design. The second challenge was the nice to have versus the must have. Some ideas that we had wouldn't have been able to be implemented in time for MVP. And so that came to a larger discussion of if it should be dropped or maybe we should think about doing a phase 2. The third challenge was understanding our audience and what their intention was. There was a lot that they could do with this theme, and we wanted to give them as many options as possible out of the box, still being able to hit our timeline. And then finally, typography was a challenge. So we had to find a font that utilized the SIL open font license, so it was compatible with the Drupal.org distribution packaging requirements. It also had to provide a wide variety of font weights and fit with the theme and design that it was updated and felt modern. So what we ended up with was Metropolis for our sans serif font, and Surreal, or not Surreal, sorry, that's the designer of Laura. And Laura, which is a Google font, the designer is Surreal, which I think I'm pronouncing that right, is for our serif font. So now I'm going to take you into a guided tour of the designs. So I'm going to share my screen again, and I'm going to open up Figma here. So this is a real treat because usually I use animation. So I usually do short video clips. But because this is being done over Hopin and there may be some lag, we decided to actually open up the Figma files and take you through them. So you may have to double click my screen again in order to see the guided tour. So one thing that I also wanted to mention is I may be looking a little bit back and forth just because I'm looking at the designs while I'm also trying to look at the screen and seeing all the wonderful comments that are coming in. So there may be some back and forth with my head, and I apologize for that ahead of time. So when we started applying to the design to pages, we started with the out-of-the-box landing page and with an article page. The reasoning for this is because we wanted to design for our worst-case scenarios first. So with the out-of-the-box landing page, that would probably have the least amount of content that would appear on a page. Then an article page would probably be the best-case example of what would have the most content on the page. So with the out-of-the-box landing page, our major goal was basically to rework and organize the content so it was more helpful to get a user started. So we made some copy suggestions and also introduced some new copy to kind of help guide users along and provide helpful links. So with the article page, what we did is we created a hypothetical blog article that touted the new theme. And this allowed us to work out more complex patterns of the design system, including refining the type system. So figuring out what our H1 through H5s would look like, what our body copy would look like, what quotation copy would look like, and caption copy. This also allowed us to work out other patterns like tables, lists, and what comments would look like, and then how these patterns would work together on a page itself. So once we had that complete, we then focused on figuring out the navigation and the header and all the different states that it could appear in. So we wanted to provide a second level dropdown that users can activate out of the box. And this would allow users to give them a little bit more control when organizing their IA structure when it came to navigation. And that dropdown had to feel modern. It had to fit with the design. So we kept it pretty simple, used a slight drop shadow, which I don't know is coming through. Sometimes drop shadows don't come through screen shares, but we used a slight drop shadow and then bringing in some of the core colors of the Olivero theme. So search was large. We wanted search to feel large and upfront and focused. And this would help it feel a little bit more modern. But it also needed to feel like a search bar itself. And there was actually a lot of back and forth that we had with the search bar that I'll review a little bit later. But we ended up going with a darker version of the search bar because it felt modern, but it also felt like a search bar. So one thing with the navigation is that the navigation had to be flexible. So with the design here, this is like the best case scenario. So we have 5 items in the design here for the navigation, and all those navigational items are pretty short. This probably most likely wouldn't happen. So what we had to figure out was what would happen if a user were to have 10 navigational items and they all had pretty long line lengths. So what we did is we wrapped up the navigation in a hamburger nav after it hits a max width. And this actually allowed us to bring these patterns down to tablet and mobile. So as you can see here, navigation on mobile. One thing with the header on mobile is that we wanted to include more room for branding. So we wrapped up some of the secondary items like the sign up, the login, and the search into the expanded version of the navigation. So one thing to note too is we have a neat interaction that I can't really show here, but if afterwards I'll share a link with you guys where you be able to go to a demo and actually see how this works. But with the Olivero theme, on scroll down, the navigation itself wraps up into a hamburger nav that the user can actually access at any time. So if they click that hamburger nav, the navigation would expand on desktop. We also had to include, think about how users would use the area for branding and site naming. So what we did is we designed several different variations for backgrounds that branding could appear on. So we have lighter backgrounds for darker branding, and then we also have darker backgrounds that the user can choose if they are using, if their branding or logo is lighter. And really quickly, with the blog listing page, I just wanted to note that our main focus was to increase scannability. So what we did is we made titles really large, and then we have descriptions and dates we set to secondary. And we felt like this would help increase the scannability when users are looking for specific keywords. Pagination, we actually took a lot of clues from Claro from this. And if you don't know what Claro is the admin redesign initiative that has been ongoing. And so they had already gone through this big design process and gotten feedback for accessibility. And so we had actually taken a lot of cues from Claro and brought them into Olivero because their stuff had already gone through accessibility review. And we felt like we wanted some similarity between the two themes. So with the editor tabs, we didn't do much of an update with these. All we did was update the color and the fonts so they fit with the theme. There was some back and forth with the editor tabs that I will review in a little bit and show you some of the evolution of those. And forms. So there's a lot of back and forth with forms. We had to make forms feel modern and up to date and fit with the Olivero theme, but they also had to be accessible. So what we did is we took a lot of cues from Claro, especially when it came to things like focus states and hover states, error messages. There's still some back and forth going on with the forms because we want to make sure that they are fully accessible. So some of the designs actually that I'm reviewing right now may already be updated in the theme. So Mike and Putra have been diligently going and updating some of the accessibility feedback that's been coming through to make sure that it passes accessibility. And finally, the design has to work with right to left languages. So we just did a really quick mock-up to make sure that, that it read correctly and that everything still worked okay within the Olivero theme that we had designed. So now I just really quickly want to review ideas that didn't make it. So this is kind of like the bloopers reel of the of the presentation. So I'm going to review the admin bar real quick. So we landed on a light version of the editor tabs. I call it the admin bar, but it's actually the editor tabs. But we had started with a darker version, and we had actually gotten feedback that this felt too focused, and it didn't really fit with our light and bright adjective that we had originally established. So there was some other ideas that came through with the editor tabs. So we had a couple ideas of trying to make the editor tabs like have less hierarchy on the page. So there were some ideas that we designed where they actually were in the left or right-hand side of the page and would be pinned there. And we all felt that this was a really great idea, but couldn't be implemented for MVP. So the idea was kind of scratched. Sidebars. So by default, it includes, Olivero includes a right sidebar out of the box, but we also designed, thinking ahead and into the future, what if eventually we give users the option to flip the sidebar to the left or to the right? How does that sidebar interact with the content on the page? So that's something that we had designed for that isn't quite implemented yet. And then finally, search. So there was a lot of back and forth on search. This is the design that we had landed with, but we had actually started with a lighter version of the search bar, and we got a lot of feedback that the search was actually, didn't feel like a search bar. It felt more like a design element of the page. So we did a couple of variations of the search bar, still trying to keep it light and bright. But we felt like these two variations really didn't work because they deviated too much from the actual adjectives that we had established. So we ended up with the darker search bar. And then finally, I just want to review some of the design documentation. And I'm going to go really quickly just to make sure that we have a couple minutes for questions on this. So we created design documentation with the goal of creating a single source of truth. So as you're designing really quickly from page to page or artboard to artboard, some small things may be off, like the padding and spacing or typography wasn't updated after a decision was made. So with our design documentation, it's a place for other designers and developers to go to when they run across these discrepancies to kind of answer those questions. So 5 things that we focused on for Olivero documenting was typography, the grid system, styles, scale and spacing, and components and all their variations. And one thing to note too is we have documentation in 2 different places. We have documentation in the actual Olivero theme file where we create a component library. And then we also have documentation in a Google Doc, which spells out more details around things like scale and spacing and how we set up our grid system. So just really quickly going through some of the things that we have documented in the Figma file. So we have the typography documented. So all of our headings and body copy, all our different types of typography can be pulled straight from a style dropdown in Figma. Same with our colors. So all these are added to our library. So it's really easy to add colors or update colors. This has been super helpful as we revise our colors for accessibility purposes. Just going in and updating the blue dark, for example, making it a little bit darker, and then it updates it across all the pages that use that specific color. And then we have all of our components documented. So these are all Figma component library items. So it's super easy to pull from these items and put them onto an artboard. And it's easy for us as designers to update them as we get feedback because it updates them on all the artboards that have that are utilizing these components. So we want to make sure that we are capturing everything. So we have, all the different types of branding that can appear. We have all of our forms as components, so we can update those as they come in. And we also have our grid system as a library item. So it's super easy to update the grid system if we update it. And also it's easy to apply to new artboards as you are adding new pages. And just one thing to note too is that I pulled this diagram from our Google documentation, but this just kind of shows how the grid system changes from mobile to desktop, and why something like this needs a little bit more detail in a Google Doc for developers to fully understand how they should be laying out the grid system when they're starting the development process. So love to talk a little bit more about Olivero, but we're coming up on time here. So it looks like we have a little bit of time for questions. I do know that we do have this room for longer than 11. So if people want to stick around.
Yeah, there's not a hard stop unless there's a session you're needing to get to. But there are 2 questions already I see in the space.
Okay.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
Sounds
there's
good.
a lag
one thing
here.
That I do want to know is that, I have a couple links here. If you want to learn a little bit more about Olivero, highly recommend going to the drupal.org/project/Olivero link. You'll be able to access things like the Figma files and the documentation that we created in Google and learn a little bit more about the process that we didn't get to in this talk. And then we also have a Slack channel. So if you want to join the initiative and help out, highly recommend that you join the Slack channel in drupal.slack.com and just look for the Olivero channel. And then we also have our evaluation. So please fill this out. This is a link, another reminder.
It's pinned at the top of the chat, actually, thanks to Bethany. So,
cool.
So two quick questions I've already seen. I'll take the first one and I'll pass the second one along to Jen. The first one was from Dan about, and I won't try to say your last name. Having the last name Ponchat, I'm quite accustomed to people mispronouncing my last name. But he asks, was load time performance considered when selecting fonts and the number of fonts and font weights? And the answer to that is essentially yes, in that early on, actually, we were doing a lot of work to try to limit the number of weights, especially across, since we wanted to have both a sans serif and a serif face within the design system. And as we went along, there was a constant back and forth, and Mike Herschel, who has been commenting here and there, and Putra and others were helping us evaluate, like, where do we, at what point will the fonts that we're working with, what number of weights and whatnot, do we maybe start seeing a performance hit? Thankfully, we actually didn't really run into, at least not that I recall, Jen can correct me, we never ended up having pushback saying this is way too many weights, because we essentially kept the number of weights for each face fairly low. So yeah, the next question I saw, Jen, if you want to talk about this, was related to how much we were able to or not able to do any usability testing within the process.
Yeah, so unfortunately, because of the MVP deadline that we had, we weren't able to do much usability testing. We would have actually really liked to do more usability testing. But that is one of the things that we actually considered as the theme gets released is making sure that we have a way to take feedback, and then that way we can improve the theme as we start rolling out new features, or just going through and like bug fixing too. So
yeah, the design currently is not actually done, quote unquote, and we still, even right now, there is a paper doc with several tasks. Mike and Putra and the team working on it continue to share things that are being found. So usability testing is sort of still in progress, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering if I missed any others. We are at the hour right now, so if any of you had a different session that you were hoping to get to, I just want to give you a fair warning. Please know that it's at the hour. And for those of you who came, there's been a lot of people through here. We really appreciate. I'm happy to stay on if there are more questions. I'm not sure if I saw any question. Can you explain the spectrum analysis exercise a little more? From David Loop. And let's see, there's another one. What's next for the Olivero theme? Those look like the two that we've missed so far. The spectrum analysis exercise, one thing I'll note on that is that the most important thing over the years that I've found doing that is to ensure that both adjectives that you select, even if they're in opposition, neither are broadly a perceived negative, because it loses its value entirely. So things like formal versus casual, like, can vary brand to brand which of those they want. It's none of them are inherently negative words. But if you put things in opposition, like that sound negative in and of themselves, like fresh versus stale or something like that, you'll tend to only find that people want the thing that's not negative. So the actual hardest part of it is trying to select. The examples that we used, I've sort of, we developed some, we peppered in some of them. We've developed them over the years. Margot Bloomstein wrote a book on content strategy that had a wholly different exercise, but had a whole list of adjectives in it that I remember working off of at one point when I first started trying to create these exercises. That book, I believe, was called Content Strategy at Work. Is that right? I'll look that up and post it after. But Jen, did you have any other details you wanted to share on spectrum analysis exercise?
No, it's just that I think the hardest part is from the spectrum analysis is coming up with the adjectives that you want to use. And we actually have been experimenting with adding visuals to those adjectives, because we've had some clients come back and be like, well, can you explain what light and bright means? So we'll actually have a visual of a website that illustrates what light and bright, what we're thinking about when it comes to light and bright versus dark and impactful. So.
Yeah. And the other thing that I will say about spectrum analysis is a lot of the value is in the discussion. It's an exercise that we've done historically in actual live in-person workshops. And in this case, we developed a way to do it together online. But where exactly the gravity of people's answers fall is informative. But when you get the group of stakeholders talking out loud about why they think it should fall where, a lot of times the real insights about what people stylistically want to see happen come out. So Another question was Layout Builder in mind at all when building the theme for content entry experience? And I feel like, I don't know if Mike Herschel can even jump in but that almost feels like more of a Mike question. Let's see.
Oh, he's in.
This is Nito Mosquito here.
I know. Hi, Mike.
Right. Hey,
Hey.
Can you hear me okay?
We're drafting people now.
Yeah, right. You two like completely rock this. This is like great. So thanks for like your like the thought process that goes involved. Like people just don't realize like the thought process in this is so deep and thoughtful. And like I have implemented websites that I do not like the designs for, and it's my thing I hate the most. And this is just like so easy to work with because I just love it. Thank you. So to get to the question, Layout Builder. Like I don't think you two like kind of put support for this in the design process, but we sure did theme for it, you know. So like core ships with a number of different like what do you call it, layouts, you know, like 3 wide, 4 wide, and different options in there. We override the templates for all those just to make sure there's proper spacing, because within like our grid system there's like what is it, like 18 pixels or something like that gap in between those, and so we made sure that those like between the different regions they're 18 pixels. And that we have like, we're implementing vertical rhythm, which y'all didn't talk about, but there's vertical rhythm units between each of the sections going in. So it should look and work wonderful. There's one issue that I've seen in the issue queue that I need to tackle. Ta-da.
Yeah, and I do have a recollection of a conversation when we were trying to work out variations for block designs and with headings, without, and how does this block appear? And then we started working out, okay, but with Layout Builder and the flexibility that's going to be there to put these types of things in here, are we going to have contextual awareness? And so there was some discussion in the design process where needed, but most of the lift on the Layout Builder stuff was not on the designers.
Yeah.
I see a question from Brett Williamson. What's next for the Olivero theme? Any enhancements or new features coming?
Yeah, so like the main, I'm going to throw a link in there, and this is a site that just literally launched by this woman Karen, who's in like somewhere in Canada, and it's like basically the Olivero theme, but they ended up sub-theming it, which we don't officially support, and to change the colors. But like the biggest thing that people want is just to be able to change those colors, you know. That's more difficult than it sounds because of course commitment support IE 11. Like if we could just change, you know, like the CSS custom properties and do it, it would be great. But that is on the horizon, because like that's something I personally want. And if it can't go in core, we might make like a sub theme, contributed theme or something like that, you know. But long story short, I really want to get that done. I want like a dark mode and I want things like that. But right now we're just concentrating on getting this into core. Like there's core coding requirements with like JavaScript selectors. We're focusing on making our focus states consistent across like everything. There's a lot of accessibility issues. We haven't crossed the accessibility gate yet, and then we have to get into core. And like, so getting into core is just huge, and it's going to be a big lift from here. So we're going to get into core, hopefully as stable, but like more likely experimental, but we're not going to be default until at the earliest Drupal 9.2. But yeah.
On the color front, we did, on the design side at least, we're thinking of color typologically as we were designing, and built it out in Figma in a way that would basically make it a little simpler for us down the road when we're able to take on that new feature, which is exciting. I'd love to do it, to have color variations available, and then to have some kind of a system in place for color override that would scale across the sort of HSL variations of colors would be really neat. But
yeah, my plan for implementing that is just to kind of cheat off a Claro, whatever they do. I'm just going to like look over their shoulder and be like, all right.
Great. Cool. Have I missed any other questions? I think I've caught the ones with Q's in front. If I've missed your question, please let me know quickly in the chat. But thanks so much, everyone, and for the kind words and positive feedback. I'm excited seeing Ryan saying he's going to start contributing. So hopefully this session, if nothing else, makes you feel like, hey, maybe I could participate in a Drupal project. So that's great.
Well, thank you, everybody.
Thanks so much. Y'all have a great whatever remains of your calendar day.
Yeah.
Bye, all.